Let's see. Oh, there we are. We're in fact in business. So, hi everyone. Sorry about the sudden manifestation of sound. What a crowd! This is so exciting. It's like bingo night or something. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you for coming. It's really nice to see everybody. I have a very quick and simple and enjoyable task, which is to just give you a few warm words of welcome. I'm Kenneth Kitt. I'm the chair of the English department. And it's great to have you here, and I want to welcome you not just to tonight's talk, but to the 2012 speaker series of Rehumanizing the University, New Perspectives on the Liberal Arts. And this series is kind of coordinated. I've just realized I'm supposed to hold both mics up. Coordinated and sponsored by the UF Center for the Humanities and the Public Sphere. But it has many fabulous and illustrious co-sponsors who are listed in your program. They include many of our colleges, centers and institutes, a number of departments, English, classics, history. So thanks to everyone for their involvement and participation. So I know we're excited about tonight's talk and the rest of the series this fall. There is a program inside this sheet, which is on your table, so have a look at that if you haven't had a chance. Our speaker tonight, as you well know, is Kerry Wolf, illustrious literary and cultural critic, and especially known for his work in posthuman theory and the posthumanities. And Kerry's very prolific and very provocative. His work is very influential across a range of fields. Animal studies, disability studies, systems theory, environmental and ecological studies, the list goes on. And I know a lot of us in this room have read his work and used it and maybe perhaps abused it. I don't know, appropriated it in ways that may or may not be fortunate. But we're excited to have the chance to hear directly from him and learn more. I first read What is Posthumanism, for example, in my colleague John Levy's seminar on the Posthumanities, which was focused on the question of the animal, human and non-human, a couple of years ago. And I know that sort of Sid Dobrin's work on post-composition has been in dialogue with Cary, and then a number of other of my graduate student and faculty colleagues have been sort of in dialogue with Cary's work for a number of years, including Sarah Mitchum back there and her work on the wolf dogs, and a number of other folks. So it's exciting. One of Cary's sort of central arguments, which I think is important to keep in mind, is that a lot of what passes for or claims to be sort of post-human theory or post-humanities is really secretly the same old humanism, and especially the kind of idea or practice of human exceptionalism, right? The sort of idea that the human animal is superior to other life forms, and you can make this distinction through speech, through reason, through certain kinds of physical, intellectual dexterity, and so forth. And so it's a kind of interesting, I think Cary's work puts very interesting pressure on the question of what it might mean to rehumanize something, or to humanize it, to rehumanize what's been dehumanized. What would it mean for the university to be rehumanized? I think I'm in favor of that, if that means that it's going to be a kinder and gentler place. But the question, I think, is also about metaphor and about language and about epistemology. It's one of those other central points, is that we've got to think differently. It's not just about representation. So I think we're all going to be interested to hear what he has to say tonight about his particular title of his talk is Biopolitics of the Posthumanities. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Bonnie Evraz, who is the director of the Center for the Humanities and Public Sphere and also a professor of history. And Bonnie will introduce Professor Wolf. So thank you. Again, great to see you here.
Welcome, everyone. It seems that the microphone is working this evening. As some of you who've been to our former events know, that is not always the case, so we're happy about that. It's my great pleasure to welcome you, and I'm so glad to see so many of you here this evening to the first and opening lecture of our series this semester. As many of you know, the series started last year. We brought 8 speakers to campus over the course of the academic year. And we'll be hosting 4 speakers this semester to talk on various subjects that are connected to the series theme. And next term, we'll be continuing the series with a set of roundtables which apply many of the questions that have been asked over the course of the past 18 months to this campus, to talk about the history of the University of Florida and the future of the University of Florida, the place of the humanities here, area studies, the connections between the humanities and the STEM fields, and I hope that many of you will join us for that as well. Those of you who have attended earlier lectures in the series know that our speakers have discussed various aspects of the past, present, and future of the humanities in higher education. Tonight's presentation by Professor Kerry Wolf is particularly focused on what amounts to a rejection of the assumption in the classical humanities that necessary divisions exist between humans and animals and between society and nature, and the broader political, ethical, and ontological implications of that change. This work points to new and unfamiliar directions for some of us that humanities research is currently taking, and it's a very fitting topic, I believe, in Florida at present, given the debates about the continuing relevance of the humanities in Florida and at the University of Florida. Before continuing with a more formal introduction of Professor Wolf, I want to take a moment now to acknowledge the sponsorship of all of the entities and organizations that have made tonight's event possible. And to spare you a list of these, which I read at earlier events, we've placed it on a slide. We're very, very grateful for the support that we've received from all parts of the university. Tonight's event received sponsorship from the Rothman Endowment, from the Center for the Humanities in the Public Sphere, as well as the Albert Brick Chair in English, the Marston Milbrower Eminent Scholar Chair in the Department of English, and the Department of English. I also want to extend my great thanks to Dr. Sophia Akerd, who has been indispensable to this series, as well as our office assistant, Matt Delvaux, and in the Shared Services Center, Debbie Whalen and Althea Geiger, who helped to prepare for this lecture as well. As I've already noted, I haven't noted yet, we have information placed near the entrance if you'd like to get onto our mailing list at the center, because some of you don't look familiar to me. So if you'd like to come to our future events, we hope you'll join us. We promise not to send too many emails. And also, I invite all of you to join us for the reception that will be held in the entrance to this section of the library following the question and answer period. Now, at last, I'm very pleased this evening to be able to introduce Professor Kerry Wolf, who is the Bruce and Elizabeth Dunleavy Professor of English at Rice University, and until July, he was also the chair of the Department of English. Professor Wolf received his PhD from Duke University in 1990, and after teaching for 8 years at Indiana University in English, American Studies, and Cultural Studies, he moved to SUNY Albany, where he remained until 2003, when he accepted his current position at Rice University in Houston. And his publications are far too many to list here, but I do want to mention at least some of them. His books include The Limits of American Literary Ideology in Pound and Emerson, published in 1993, Animal Rights, American Culture, The Discourse of Species and Posthumanist Theory, published in 2003, Critical Environments, Postmodern Theory and the Pragmatics of the Outside, published in 2009, and most recently, What is Posthumanism, published in 2009. He has another book that's coming out this December. It's called Before the Law, Humans and Other Animals in a Biopolitical Frame with University of Chicago Press. And he's also edited numerous collections, including Zoontologies, The Question of the Animal, published in 2003. He is the founding editor of the series Posthumanities at the University of Minnesota Press, and his areas of research and teaching include animal studies and posthumanism, systems theory and pragmatism, biopolitics and biophilosophy, and American literature and culture, particularly poetry. So without cutting further into his time, I ask that you please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Wolf for his talk this evening entitled Biopolitics of the Posthumanities.
Actually, I project well enough that I don't need a... Do I have to wear a mic? I guess for the... Yeah, they like not. Yeah. Unfortunately, when I taught at Indiana, I don't know what you guys do in Florida, but part of the gig is you teach one big lecture course a year. So I always taught a lecture of about 140 students with 3 TAs. So I got really good at talking to big rooms, teaching at IU. Okay, well, let me thank everyone you thanked. The consortium of sponsoring institutional bodies, and especially the center and their crew, Bonnie and Sophia and Matt, for all their help. They took me out this afternoon, and we saw some, well, earlier I saw some campus-size gators. And then we went to the, what is the sink? Yeah, we went there, and then we saw some real gators, some non-campus gators. In fact, we almost stepped on a couple that were about Sophia's size, more or less. So that was fun. We have gators in Houston too, but I don't know. They're not as iconic as your gators, you know. So we get them, but I don't know. There's something not Texas about gators in the way that you think of Florida. So we're known for other stuff, I guess, for better, for better and for worse. Guns, you know, bad politicians, etc. Good food, excellent food. But anyway, so what I'm going to talk about tonight is it's kind of an outtake from this new book that's coming out, I think in November, certainly by December. It's very different from what is Posthumanism, which is really like a lot of books these days, is a kind of a cut and paste collection of essays dressed up to look like a book. And Before the Law is really a 40,000-word essay, so it's a very different type of piece of work. And I did it because I was invited a few years ago to do a piece for a special issue of the journal Law, Culture, and Humanities on animals. And I finished the essay, and I just thought there was a lot of unfinished business that I wanted to follow up on. And now I'm actually following up on that. I was speaking with one of your colleagues a minute ago about now I'm actually working on a piece on systems theory and the immunitary paradigm of biopolitical thought that's very important to Italian political philosopher Roberto Esposito. So I don't know what that'll turn into, but it just seemed like it was unfinished business to me. And some of the reasons that it's unfinished business have to do with the different genealogies of and institutionalizations of these different kinds of work, and I'm going to talk about that briefly in my talk. I'm also going to touch on a couple of things that those of you who were at the lunch seminar today, you will have heard a little bit of this before. I mean, I only have so many ideas, and they come out at inopportune times. So you may have heard some of this before, but not most of it. So if you were at lunch today, just be patient. So I want to talk about the biopolitics of the posthumanities, specifically in terms of the role of humanities in thinking about the changing status of non-human animals, as our understanding of them has changed dramatically over the past 20 or 30 years, a process which has largely, in my opinion, left our educational and our legal and our political institutions in the dust. There are signs that that's changing, but the change has been less because of pressure from inside the humanities than pressure from outside. Obviously, the agitations of the animal rights movement and people working on animal welfare, an explosion of new knowledge in ecology and cognitive ethology, and not least, I think, at least in my experience, the mainstream literacy of our own students about things like factory farming and vegetarianism and locavore foodways and a lot of other things as well. Still, as a host of thinkers over the past 30 or 40 years have noted, the humanities have not traditionally been very good at thinking about the question of non-human beings, nor have the humanities been very responsive to their changing plight and their needs in the way that we have been with previously marginalized or under-recognized groups, as work in the humanities and women's studies or critical race studies or gay and lesbian studies has been. Moreover, and equally importantly, the humanism of the humanities has prevented the invitation that animal studies provides to fundamentally rethink the nature of human being itself, and of course this is relevant to the entire year-long theme, the nature of human being itself as just one of the myriad life forms that roam the planet, albeit one with particular characteristics and powers, as the recent geological term Anthropocene attests. And this is why the model of ever-expanding studies, as in animal studies coming after gay and lesbian studies that I just invoked, expanding the sphere of liberal incorporation by race, then by gender, then by sexuality, and finally by species, is really, in my view, inadequate to the task at hand, because those doing the expanding tend to remain quite unproblematically secure in a philosophical and political floor plan of subjectivity that, after all, we all thought was largely the problem in the first place. In this light, as I argue in my book, What is Posthumanism?, the humanities would have to become the posthumanities in thinking through the question of non-human life, which would in turn leave our sense of the human radically changed. Both animal studies and biopolitical thought have attempted to address some of these problems, but from very different vantage points. These differences, I think, are in no small part the result of the quite different intellectual genealogies from which they emerge. Animal studies took shape in the wake of the animal rights movement, and primarily, I would argue, as a North American phenomenon, although, as you know, the movement has its roots in 19th century Britain. Its purview from the beginning was primarily ethics, and it increasingly concerned itself with complicating and even abandoning the philosophical frameworks from the liberal justice tradition in analytic philosophy that gave birth to the animal rights movement in the first place. So you fast forward from Tom Reagan and Peter Singer, let's say, to Jacques Derrida. Biopolitics, on the other hand, is largely a European phenomenon, deriving canonically from the later work of Michel Foucault and finding a strong foothold in contemporary Italian political philosophy in figures such as Giorgio Agamben, Antonio Negri, and Roberto Esposito. Much of the work in animal studies doesn't concern itself with politics or political theory in any direct way, and it's possible to work in biopolitics without really being interested at all in the question of non-human animals. And you may know Donna Haraway takes Michel Foucault to task in her book When Species Meet for this very reason. Still, what both approaches have in common, and this is why I'm pairing them here today, is what you might call a deeply skeptical relation to this creature that we call human, at least as it's defined by humanism, whose features are ably glossed by Bruno Latour in his book We Have Never Been Modern as, quote, the free agent, the citizen builder of the Leviathan, the other of a relationship, consciousness, the cogito, the hermeneute, the inner self, the thee and thou of dialogue, and so on. As Latour notes, and there's a version of this claim in Foucault's work as well, of course, it's not enough simply to historicize the human. Animal studies and biopolitical thought don't merely decenter the human of the humanities, they fundamentally imprecate the human in multiple overdetermining contexts that range from the biological and the evolutionary at one end to the technological and the cultural and the political at the other end. This means that the very place and constitution of the human itself must be rethought from the ground up. Or as Latour puts it, quoting again, we first have to relocate the human to which humanism does not render sufficient justice. So part of my argument is that moving beyond humanism is not about rejecting humanism, it's that humanism doesn't give us a robust enough theoretical vocabulary to really be able to describe the full complexity of what we want to talk about. In this light, animal studies and biopolitics pose an unprecedented challenge to the humanities to rethink not just the place of the human and the forms of knowledge taken to be germane to the humanities, but also the relationship of scholarly and critical work in the humanities to the ethical and political questions that animate these new forms of thought. Even more specifically, I'm interested in the extent to which animal studies and biopolitics can help us make sense of the extremely schizophrenic way that we treat animals in contemporary society. Or let's just say for the moment, we, in what Richard Rorty calls the rich North Atlantic bourgeois democracies, his no-nonsense phrase, since part of my whole point here is to not take who this we is for granted. So I want to take two examples that I start the book with before the law. First example, in June of 2008, as you all may know, the Environmental Committee of the Spanish Parliament approved resolutions to grant basic rights to great apes on a quite traditional model of human rights. To use the language of the Great Ape Project, co-authored by philosophers Peter Singer and Paolo Cavalieri, the three basic rights outlined for this new community of equals are, and I'm largely quoting now, 1, the right to life, which means the members of the community may not be killed except in very strictly defined circumstances such as self-defense. 2, the protection of individual liberty, which forbids imprisonment without due process and only where it can be shown to be for their own good. or necessary to protect the public, and 3, the prohibition of torture, which forbids the deliberate infliction of severe pain on a member of the community. And as you may know, a similar resolution is perpetually before the U.S. Congress at this point as well. On the other side of the schizophrenic equation, second example. According to statistics provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, in the year before that, in 2007, about 9 billion, and that is billion with a B, animals were killed in the United States for food, the vast majority of them raised in confined feeding operations, or CAFOs, or what we call factory farms, which is double the number from 1980. This figure, moreover, does not include the killing of fish, crustaceans, and other farmed animals, nor does it include equines. Moreover, as the National Commission on Industrial Farm Animal Production concluded in its final report of 2006, quote, "At present, federal regulation of the treatment of farm animals is minimal, with the 2 main pieces of legislation having been passed in 1873 and 1958. Now, when you put these 2 examples side by side, I think you have to say, what the hell is going on here? As I want to suggest in these remarks, whatever is going on, and obviously there are a lot of things going on, we need something other than the blunt instrument of human versus animal to make sense of it. On the one hand, cows and pigs killed in factory farms aren't that dramatically different in terms of the sentient characteristics that we consider morally relevant to their treatment from chimpanzees and other great apes referenced in the parliamentary resolution. On the other hand, those same great apes demonstrably have a lot more in common with Homo sapiens than they do with millions of other animals, starfish, let's say, or cockroaches, with whom they are grouped. So how can we line up these phenomenological and ontological differences with the differences in legal and political status that seem to obey quite another logic? One famous attempt to do this, as you all know, is animal rights philosophy. But animal rights philosophy has increasingly come to be seen as problematic to many people, mainly because the rights framework itself and the model of the rights-holding subject that it promotes seems to many people to kind of flatten out rather than open up and complicate these kinds of questions. On the one side, you have legal theorists like Richard Posthumanities and Cass Sunstein and Richard Epstein, who believe that the adaptation of the rights model to talk about animals is, for various reasons, fundamentally wrong-headed. On the other side, we find animal rights philosophers such as Peter Singer and Tom Reagan, who, to my mind, have convincingly rebutted the Posner-Epstein line. But never mind, what's more important is that a third view, and this is more or less my view compared to these other ones, is represented by philosophers such as Cora Diamond and Jacques Derrida, who argue that the opposing sides of the animal rights debate share actually a deeper identity than they're aware of. While Derrida is, quote, and I'm quoting now, on principle sympathetic with those who have good reasons to rise up against the way animals are treated in industrial production, in slaughter, in consumption, and experimentation, he nevertheless believes, quoting again, that it's preferable not to introduce this problematic concerning the relations between humans and animals into the existing juridical framework, unquote, by extending some form of human rights to animals. This is so, he argues, because, quoting again, to confer or to recognize rights for animals, in quotes, is a surreptitious or implicit way of confirming a certain interpretation of the human subject, unquote, which we then extend and indeed retrench when we grant those rights to animals. To make a long story short, in other words, the model of the rights-holding subject and the interests that ground those rights end up looking an awful lot like a diminished form of a normative idea of human being. But of course, what's wanted is a way to think different ways of being in the world, both animal and human, in their specificity and in their multiplicity, and then think about that in relation to the question of legal and political norms. A different but related objection to the rights framework is raised by Cora Diamond, who argues that, quote, when genuine issues of justice and injustice are framed in terms of rights, they're thereby distorted and trivialized because of the underlying tie between rights and a system of entitlement that's concerned not with evil done to a person, but with how much he or she gets compared to other participants in the system, unquote. Instead, she argues, what's crucial to our sense of the injustice done to animals and to humans is the embodiment and the vulnerability that we share with them, which grounds our repulsion at the brute subjection of the body that animals so often endure. For Diamond, quote, the horror of the conceptualizing of animals as putting nothing in the way of their use as mere stuff depends upon a comparable horror at human relentlessness and pitilessness in the exercise of power, unquote, toward other human beings, as in, for example, the practice of torturing political prisoners. To put it this way is to immediately raise the question of what biopolitical thought, after Giorgio Agamben, calls bare life, life that is directly exposed to violence, life that is killable but not murderable, as he puts it. Or as Judith Butler writes in her book Precarious Life, The Powers of Mourning and Violence, quote, the fundamental question that needs to be reopened in the current political context is whose lives count as lives? And finally, what makes for a grievable life? Despite our differences in location and history, she continues, my guess is that it's possible to appeal to a we, a community of those who deserve ethical consideration by virtue of their embodied vulnerability and exposure, unquote. Now, as you all may know, Butler does not extend, and we talked about this in the seminar a little bit, Butler does not extend that question to non-human forms of life, and that's a failure shared for the most part by biopolitical thought itself, as Haraway, among others, has pointed out. Still, it's worth asking, I think, and I ask it in this book, if the bios-zoe distinction of biopolitics might be of some use in parsing the kinds of questions with which I began with regard to our treatment of non-human animals. A massive invitation to do so is offered, of course, by Jacques Derrida's explicit analogy in his later work between our treatment of animals in contemporary society and the Holocaust of the Second World War, an analogy whose multiple resonances Derrida, as an Algerian Jew, is well attuned to, simply because the Holocaust has been exhibit A in much of the philosophical literature on modern biopolitics. Derrida's assertion is quite continuous with what's been called the essentially thanatological function of biopolitics in modern society, which has in turn deployed the distinction between the human and the animal as a key technology for subjecting populations, human populations, as many survivors of the Holocaust themselves have noted about their treatment of in the camps in their testimonials. We thus find, as Roberto Esposito, another Italian political philosopher, argues, we thus find a key element of the contemporary political landscape, what he calls, quote, the radical transformation of the idea of humanitas, unquote, that escapes the very political and legal concepts inherited from modernity. Quoting him now, presumed for centuries as what places human beings above the simple common life of other living species, and therefore charged with a political value, humanitas increasingly comes to adhere to its own biological material, unquote. What's involved here, however, is not so much the animalization of human populations pure and simple, but rather the exposure of how that designation simultaneously masks and makes possible the more fundamental operations of modern politics by means of what Agamben calls, quote, the anthropological machine, which each time decides upon and recomposes the conflict between man and animal, unquote. A machine that depends upon, to use terms he borrows from Aristotle, the distinction between bios, or political form of life, and zoe, or bare life. As both Foucault and Agamben emphasize, racialization has often served as a halfway house in this biopolitical process. And Exhibit A, of course, is the Nazis' treatment of the Jews during World War II, which makes it clear that you can't talk about biopolitics without talking about race, and you can't talk about race without talking about species. Foucault explores this topic in his lectures from 1975 to 6, collected in Society Must Be Defended. Racism, he notes, quote, creates caesuras within the biological continuum addressed by biopower. It is a way of fragmenting the field of the biological that power controls, unquote, so that some populations may be killed through the exercise of sovereign power or may be simply allowed to die, what Foucault calls bluntly indirect murder. Quoting him again, in a normalizing society, race or racism is the precondition that makes killing acceptable. This thanatological aspect of biopolitics dominates Agamben's writings on the subject, that you all may know. Indeed, Agamben sees the Nazi death camps, quote, as not a historical fact and an anomaly belonging to the past, but rather the hidden matrix and nomos of the political space in which we are still living, unquote. Foucault's concept of the biopolitical, however, is more ambivalent. As he famously defines biopolitics, it is, quote, the power to make live. Sovereignty took life and let live, and now we have the emergence of a power that I would call the power of regularization, and it, in contrast, consists in making live and letting die, unquote. As Esposito puts it, Foucault allows us to see that for biopolitics, quote, what's in question is no longer the distribution of power or its subordination to the law, nor the kind of regime or consensus that's obtained, but rather something that precedes it because it pertains to its primary material, unquote. As is well known, Foucault's main examples are medicine, madness, the rise of the various health professions under the broader regime of governmentality, and its specifically modern techniques of managing, directing, and enhancing the lives of population via hygiene, population sciences, food sciences, and so on, the better to extend and consolidate political power at newer, more finely grained, more capillary levels of control. This marks a subtle but important, I think, difference between the concept of biopolitics in Foucault and Agamben. While it's no doubt true, both in Foucault's own discourse and in point of fact, that sovereignty continues to be an important force in modern biopolitics, as Agamben argues, Foucault's point is that it becomes recontextualized and finally subordinated to a fundamental political shift. Where Foucault allows us to disarticulate sovereignty and modern biopower, Agamben continues to orient the subjection of bare life and the disposition of the bios-zoe distinction to the paradigm of sovereignty, essentially to the ability of sovereignty to declare a state of exception at a moment's notice and thus keep open the possibility that any form of life being thrust into the condition of bare life by sovereign fiat is always possible. Now, to me, what gets lost in this very pleasing, but I think overly formal symmetry between sovereignty and bare life in Agamben is our ability to think a much more highly differentiated and highly nuanced biopolitical field of effectivity. In this sense, what Maurizio Lazzarato, another Italian political philosopher, calls Foucault's radical displacement of the problem of sovereignty, quote, does not neglect the analysis of sovereignty, but merely points out that the grounding force will not be found on the side of power, since power is blind and weak, as Foucault puts it. Hence, power's increasing need in an increasingly complex and differentiated field for the various techniques of management, surveillance, and so on that it deploys. What we're dealing with here is not, as Esposito puts it, quote, some kind of withdrawal or contraction of the field that's subjected to law, unquote, but rather how the law, for its force, gradually shifts, quote, from the transcendental level of codes and sanctions that essentially have to do with subjects of will to the eminent level of rules and norms that are addressed instead to bodies, unquote. And I think you have to hear bodies in the broadest possible sense there. In fact, in terms of what Esposito calls not just bodies, but flesh as the level at which biopolitics operates. Lazzarato stresses that three important points follow from this. First, and I'm quoting him now, first, biopolitics is the form of government taken by a new dynamic of forces that in conjunction express power relations that the classical world could not have known. Second, that the fundamental political problem of modernity is not that of a single source of sovereign power, but of a multitude of forces. If power, in keeping with this description, is constituted from below, then we need an ascending analysis of the constitution of power dispositifs or apparatuses. And third, still quoting, biopower coordinates and targets a power that does not properly belong to it, that comes from the outside. Biopower, this is italicized, biopower is always born of something other than itself, unquote. Or in Jeff Nealon's words, in Foucault, the biopower relation names not a negative relation of domination between concrete objects, institutions, or persons, but but rather a positive, or as Foucault sometimes says, a productive relation among virtual forces, unquote. Indeed, the political payoff of Foucault's analysis of the mechanisms of governmentality resides in no small part in its anatomy of how the machinery of power is constantly racing to maintain control over the new forces that it's brought into its orbit, forces that in no small part derive from the animal bodies, both human and non-human, that are not necessarily always already abjected as they are in Agamben. Quite the contrary, those bodies are enfolded via biopower in both subjugation and resistance. And because those forces of resistance are thereby produced in very specifically articulated forms, this is what Foucault's entire body of work is about, through particular dispositifs, there's a chance, and this in no small part marks Foucault's debt to Nietzsche, as both Esposito and Deleuze point out, there's a chance for life to burst through power systematic operations in ways that are more and more difficult to anticipate and control. To put it telegraphically, power/knowledge complexifies the political resource called the body, and complexity increases risk. Thus, as Lazzarato notes, Foucault actually, quoting again, interprets the introduction of life into history, as he puts it, constructively, because it presents the opportunity to propose a new ontology, one that begins with the body and its potential, unquote, over and against the prevailing Western tradition of understanding the political subject as above all a subject of law, unquote. Indeed, he argues, one of Foucault's key insights is that without factoring freedom and the resistance of forces into the equation as constitutive of the problem, quote, the modern dispositifs of biopower remain incomprehensible, unquote. Excuse me. This is to say then that we need to separate the question of the material and technical dispositifs of biopower from the question of sovereignty per se. To return to the earlier analogy between factory farming and the Holocaust, there's no doubt that the two are vastly different when we think of political theory in terms of sovereignty as constitutive of the problem. Indeed, in that sense, factory farming could not be called political at all. On the other hand, from the vantage point of Foucault's emphasis on the regularization of bodies and the increasing control over processes of life and death, of making live, as he puts it, it hardly needs pointing out that the practices of modern biopolitics forge themselves in the common subjugation and management of the factical existence, to use Agamben's rather bracing phrase, of both humans and animals, not least in the practices of eugenics, inoculation, sterilization, and high-efficiency killing. In fact, the assembly line processes used to kill Jews in Nazi Germany derived from production models developed by Henry Ford, who was a notorious anti-Semite, as you may know, who in turn reveals in his autobiography that the inspiration for his assembly line method for automobiles came from a visit to the Chicago slaughterhouses when he was a young man and witnessing their mechanized disassembly lines for turning animal carcasses into meat. In this new context, we're forced to conclude that current practices of factory farming and the like, while they're crucially different from the Holocaust in a bunch of different ways, some of which I've just mentioned, constitute not just some ethically embarrassing sideline of modern life that has nothing to do with politics proper, and which can well be regulated by an adjacent set of anti-cruelty laws that don't intersect with politics as such in any fundamental way. Rather, such practices must be seen not just as political, but as constitutively political for biopolitics in its modern form. Indeed, the practices of making live, in Foucault's words, through eugenics, artificial insemination, selective breeding, pharmaceutical enhancement, inoculation, and the like, are on display in the modern factory farm as perhaps nowhere else in biopolitical history. Such practices are part of a matrix that, under conditions of globalization, takes as its political object planetary life itself, for which the secondary distinction between human and animal may be deployed, as history well shows, I think, across actual species lines as necessary. They involve the exponential expansion and routinization of mechanisms and logics that extend from the Chicago slaughterhouses at the turn of the 20th century through the assembly lines developed by Ford to the Nazi death camps and back again, traversing what we can now recognize as a newly expanded community of the living. It's worth lingering for a moment over some very obvious examples of the risk involved in factory farming's attempt to maximize control over the aleatory body, as Foucault puts it, in the exercise of biopower. For example, a recent study by the Pew Commission on industrial animal farm production points out that factory farming may be good at producing edible animal products at the lowest possible cost, but, quote, there's evidence, as the New York Times puts it, that this model is economically viable only because it passes on health costs to the public in the form of occasional salmonella, antibiotic-resistant diseases, polluted waters, food poisoning, and possibly certain kinds of cancer, unquote. A nearly 100-page report done in 2008 by the Union of Concerned Scientists lists in excruciating detail the costs, both direct and indirect, borne by society for the mass-produced and industrialized killing of animals for food. Between 1997 and 2005, United States taxpayers handed over to confined feeding operations roughly $3.8 billion a year in the form of indirect subsidies, chiefly in the form of government handouts to growers of corn and soybean, the majority of which is eaten by livestock animals each year. Such subsidies artificially reduce the price of meat, poultry, and pork, and other direct subsidies further artificially reduce the cost of factory farming by shifting costs to the taxpayer. Chief among these is the Environmental Quality Incentives Program, which gives CAFOs about $100 million a year, in effect forcing taxpayers to help pay the environmental cleanup costs for factory farms. Added to these are the massive but more difficult to quantify external costs of CAFOs, which include environmental degradation and pollution of air and water that results in the large amount of energy use and animal waste produced by factory farming, reduced quality of life for rural communities, including lower property values, and so on. To even modestly reduce the water and air pollution they create would cost CAFOs more than $1 billion a year, and other external costs would likely run into the billions as well. Now, given the political logic that I've been discussing, one of these external costs, those associated with the use of antibiotics in factory farms, is worth dwelling on for a moment. As a recent New York Times article reports, 80%, this is a crazy number, I think, 80% of the antibiotics used in the United States go to livestock on factory farms. Nearly all of it administered in their food and water, and typically to healthy animals, to prevent them from becoming sick from the cramped and squalid conditions that they live in. In fact, my single home state of North Carolina uses more antibiotics for its livestock than the entire United States uses for its human population. Whoa. Not surprisingly, this has led to a startling increase in antibiotic-resistant pathogens, chief among them MRSA, an antibiotic-resistant staphylococcus bacterium that annually kills more people than AIDS. It was recently found in 70% of hogs on one factory farm and 45% of employees at another one. When such pathogens born of our own maltreatment of farm animals pose a risk to national biosecurity, the results are depressingly familiar and send us back to earlier discussions of the quote-unquote animal holocaust. In England, millions of pigs, cows, and sheep shot and bulldozed into graves and burned during the foot and mouth disease epidemic of 2001. In California in the 1970s, the killing of 9 million hens to thwart Newcastle disease. In the spring of 2004, millions of chickens, turkeys, and ducks killed worldwide, 80 million alone in Southeast Asia, 19 million more in Canada to combat H5N1 avian influenza. To me, the fundamental biopolitical logic identified by Foucault and developed by Esposito is unmistakable here. As Foucault writes in his analysis of medicalization, the harmful effects of medication are, quote, due not to errors of diagnosis or the accidental ingestion of those substances, but to the action of medical practice itself precisely because of their efficacy, unquote, leading humankind into what he calls a perilous era of history. As Esposito notes, quote, As in all areas of contemporary social systems, neurotically haunted by a continuously growing need for security, this means that the risk from which the protection is meant to defend is actually created by the protection itself, unquote. A logic that is, as we have seen, inscribed at the heart of modern biopolitics. So when we consider the use of factory farming to feed the majority of the population, its effects on public health, and therefore on public health policy, and of course its escalating costs, the devastating, literally unsustainable effects of it on the environment, and the use of massive government subsidies to prop up the entire system, is it really possible to isolate all these from the political per se? And if so, is it not a pretty thin and impoverished understanding of the political that is the result? As Foucault puts it in an interview from 1977, quoting him now, kind of a long quote, "The political is not what ultimately determines or overdetermines elementary relations. All relations of force imply a power relation, and each power relation can be referred to the political sphere of which it's a part, both as its effect and its condition of possibility. Political analysis and critique, for the most part, have to be invented, but so do strategies that will allow both modifying these relations of force and coordinating them in such a way that this modification will be possible and will actually register in reality. That is to say that the problem is not really defining a political position, which brings us back to a choice on a chessboard that's already been set up, but to imagine and to bring out new schemas of politicization," unquote. And that was all the bad news, that part of the talk. Now the other side. At this juncture, however, we have to remember the fundamentally ambivalent quality of Foucault's sense of biopolitics, focused as it is on the aleatory body, to make sense of the other half of the story, the other example that I began with. For at the very historical moment when the scale and efficiency of factory farming has never been more nightmarish, not only are we contemplating what amounts to human rights for some animals, many more animals, namely companion animals, at least in the society we live in, are receiving unprecedented levels of care, so much that the pet care industry in the United States grew in total expenditures from $17 billion in 1994 to nearly $36 billion in 2005 to $45.5 billion in 2009, and God knows what it is now. The late 1990s, as you all know, saw the birth of the famous Missiplicity Project, which Donna Haraway, among others, writes about, dedicated to cloning companion animals for those who can afford it. And short of that, as any owner of a companion animal will testify, the range and quality of veterinary care available today, dental cleaning requiring general anesthesia, ultrasounds, CAT scans, EKGs, chemotherapy, veterinary oncology, and much else besides, in other words, what Foucault calls the capacity to make live, far outstrips not only what was available a generation ago, but also, frankly, what's available to many millions of people of the world's human population. And this has led in turn to another growth industry unheard of until relatively recently, pet health care insurance, currently estimated to be a $271 million business and on track to balloon to $500 million by the end of 2012. What all this adds up to, of course, is a historically remarkable shrinkage in the gap between some human beings and their animal companions regarding quality of life in areas such as food quality, health care, and other goods and services. At the nether end of these developments, we find examples such as the rapidly expanding field of pet pharmacology. Critics like to describe it, and the booming pet services industry generally, as essentially yet another lifestyle foible of the well-to-do classes, especially baby boomers, who no longer have dependent children and thus enjoy increased affluence. Here, as elsewhere, so the story goes, what the public wants is a pill to take care of the problem and do the work. But it's not quite as simple as that, either ontologically or biopolitically. For as one writer notes, the increasing use of modern pet pharma may seem silly. The drug Reconcile, for example, that's given to dogs to treat separation anxiety is exactly like Prozac, except it tastes like liver. But it raises questions such as the following. quoting now, if the strict Cartesian view were true, that animals are essentially flesh and blood automatons lacking anything resembling human emotion, memory, and consciousness, then why do animals develop mental illnesses that eerily resemble human ones and that respond to the same medications, unquote. And as for the biopolitical dimension, some veterinary behavioral pharmacologists have pointed out that because Prozac, Paxil, and other drugs were tested for efficacy in laboratory animals long before they were used in humans, quote, you can plausibly argue that humans are in fact using animal drugs and not the other way around. Clearly then, this is kind of a complicated picture. Clearly, many animals currently flourish not in spite of the fact that they're animals, but because they are animals, or even more precisely, because they are felt to be members of our families and our communities regardless of their species. And yet, at the very same moment, billions of animals in factory farms, many of whom are very near to or indeed exceed cats and dogs and other companion animals in the capacities that we take to be relevant to moral and ethical standing and treatment, the ability to experience pain and suffering, anticipatory dread, emotional bonds and complex social interactions, and so on. If you don't believe me, spend some time with a pig one of these days. Have as horrible a life as one could imagine, also because they are animals. Clearly, then, the question here is not simply one of animal as the objected other of the human, but rather of something like a distinction between bios and zoe that cuts across species lines and actually obtains within the domain of at least domesticated animals itself. We find here an additional insight that thickens Derrida's well-known observation that the designation the animal is therefore what he calls asinine because it effaces the vast diversity of non-human life forms under a single definite article. Indeed, we might say, paraphrasing Esposito, that the animal is an ideology that masks what Rosi Braidotti, following Deleuze, calls the transversal relations in which animals and our relations with them are caught under biopolitical life. This new differentiation of the biopolitical field is what Esposito is after at the end of his book Bios, where he insists that a turn away from the thanatological logic of biopolitics can only take place if life as such, not just human versus animal life, not just Aryan versus Jewish life, not just Christian versus Islamic life, becomes the subject of immunitary protection. As Esposito writes, quote, we can say that the subject, be it a subject of knowledge, of will, or action, as modern philosophy commonly understands it, is never separated from the living roots from which it originates in the form of a splitting between the somatic and the psychic levels in which the first is never decided in favor of the second, unquote. And what this means, he continues, is, quote, there's a modality of bios that cannot be inscribed within the borders of the conscious subject and therefore is not attributable to the form of the individual or the person. And both of those should be in quotes, I think. To put it another way, if Agamben's contribution is to articulate powerfully how the anthropological machine cannot function without producing this remainder called animal, which is at the same time the retroactively posited origin that must be excluded by the political project of man, then Esposito's advance is not just to recognize the centrality of race in biopolitics, as Foucault did, but to strike a powerful blow against it by suggesting that the animal is not something that need always already be abjected. But if one of the great contributions of biopolitical thought is to show how it's impossible to talk about race without talking about species and vice versa, what must now be added is that race and species must, in turn, give way to their own deconstruction in favor of a much more highly differentiated thinking of the question of life and different forms of life in relation to biopower. This doesn't mean, as Esposito wants to argue, that all life is equal with regard to legal and political norms. And this takes us back to arguments you may remember around deep ecology and biocentrism going all the way back to the 1960s and 70s. If all life is equal, then we should let anthrax and hantavirus and SARS and MRSA achieve their creative flourishing, even if it means wiping out 80% of the human population, right? And there were people involved in deep ecology who said, yeah, I would vote for that, but when I ask for a show of hands, most people don't want to get on board with that program, right? So it doesn't mean, as Esposito wants to argue, that all life is equal with regard to legal and political norms. It simply means that in thinking questions of legal and political norms, the distinction between human and animal is of no use in thinking them. What this opens up is a new understanding of the political that focuses on the shared plight of human and non-human forms of life that are interconnected in any number of highly specific and often unpredictable ways. The distinction between bios and zoe surmounts and subsumes the distinction between human and animal for better and for worse. So that the question is not, what's your species, but rather, to recall Judith Butler's phrasing, whose lives count as lives. Last couple of paragraphs. This marks a spectacular advance, I think, over the traditional ways of thinking about the political that we inherit from the liberal justice tradition, based as it is on a picture of reciprocity, agency, contractual behavior, and the like as the sole domain of human beings who use language. But it raises a fundamental problem. And as it turns out, it's a problem confronted at the very origins of biopolitical thought, namely the problem of ethnocentrism. It's a question, as Hannah Arendt put it, of what constitutes the right to have rights. Arendt brilliantly argues in The Origins of Totalitarianism that the idea of universal human rights is dubious because it attempts to ground the standing of the subject of rights in a mere biological designation of the human being as Homo sapiens, whereas rights themselves are always a product of membership in a political community. So she holds a conventionalist and formalist idea of rights that reaches all the way back to Aristotle's Politics. Her resistance to granting rights on the basis of zoological designation and her recourse to what we might call a conventional concept of rights is perfectly correct as far as it goes, but it's immediately put under pressure for her and complicated by the historical fact that the very call of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 arises on the basis of the massive presence of millions of stateless persons, human beings derived of political standing in precisely her sense during the wake of World War II. It arises, that is, with the increasingly undeniable presence of what biopolitical thought will canonically come to call bare life. The right to have rights is indeed the question, then, if we're not simply to take for granted the ethnocentrism of saying, well, we care about those we care about and to hell with everybody else, whatever their species. And we'll use markers like race and species to designate those that we don't care about and justify killing them. And it's a question, especially if we reject a zoological answer to it, as biopolitical thought demands we do, that forces into much more tighter conjunction than our current political vocabulary can address the genetically manipulated and inoculated cow languishing on the factory farm, the stateless detainee disappeared in some internment camp, the chimpanzee used in HIV research, and the political prisoners subjected to torture. What's at stake in these lives? How are they alike and how are they different? I have my own ideas about how to address this problem, and I've talked about them in some detail in the new book. But let me just end by saying that I'm glad we're now able to raise these questions without taking for granted that the answer is, well, some of them are human and some aren't. For if there's anything that we've learned from the history of biopolitics, it's just how dangerous that answer can be. Thank you. It wasn't too long.
We do have time for questions, so
Sure, yeah.
and Professor Wolf is going to repeat your questions so that it makes it onto.
And if I forget, just remind me, because I may. I kind of when I'm doing Q&A, I kind of shift into teaching mode, which I usually don't repeat the questions that that come up. So, but yeah, I'd be happy to. Yeah. Okay, let me try to give a short version of that. She's asking, how do you refute the problem of, how do you say, well, you know, anthrax shouldn't be allowed to creatively flourish, right, is your question. Well, you know, for me that's not a problem because, and I tried to gesture to this with Arendt at the end, because I think the designation of all forms of life as being equal and being equally entitled to protection is useless and impractical, and actually a radically leveling or de-differentiating move with regard to paying attention to different kinds of life forms. Now, there are people, as I said earlier in the talk, there are people going back to debates over biocentrism and deep ecology who would get on board with that. But if you want to get on board with that, I think you have to sign up for the massive human die-off program, right? Because if all forms of life, there's kind of two problems. You could just say, well, let's let these pathogenic life forms that are going to kill off 80% of the human population flourish. Or you could say, well, actually, if all forms of life are equal and deserve equal protection, then the first thing we need to do is start killing human beings. And the reason we need to do that is Homo sapiens is demonstrably by far the most destructive species on the planet vis-a-vis other life forms, right? I don't know many people who would sign up for that program, and I wouldn't sign up for it. Even if you wanted to sign up for it, the problem is you have to step back biopolitically and think about the real kind of demographic, geopolitical distribution of how something like that would play out. And the short version is how it would play out is the way that a lot of stuff plays out, which is that poor populations who live typically in warm climates are going to get the bad end of that bargain, and the rich North Atlantic bourgeois democracies and the people who live in them who can afford to protect themselves are going to protect themselves. So even if you wanted to do that, even pragmatically, it seems to me it doesn't really, it's a naive in terms of any kind of real, strategy. When we're talking about political norms and ethical norms, it's just not, to me, not a real position. Now, what I argue in the book, and this is going to drive, there are a lot of people right now interested in plants. So whenever I give these talks now, I always get like a what about plants question. And, and I love plants. I'm not anti-plant. And it's also the case that there are, as people who study environmental ethics, there are all kinds of ways of making the case for the need to protect things that don't fit this kind of description. So, for example, I just saw a thing in New Zealand. There was a river in a really important river in New Zealand that I think was basically granted legal personhood, right? And this is, as you know, in the environmental ethics literature, this is a long-standing, there's a famous article called Should Trees Have Standing? That's an important article in the history of sort of environmental ethics and thought. So when I say this, it doesn't mean that there aren't other ways of thinking about the issue, but the way that I deal with it in the book is I say, look, you have to be able to somehow, if you're really serious about talking about political and ethical norms, you have to be able to talk meaningfully about the difference between an orangutan and a starfish and a mosquito, somehow, right? And what I do in the book is I actually go back to Heidegger's concept of Dasein and his idea of the thrownness, of what he calls the thrownness of Dasein, and essentially argue that, look, there are creatures, some creatures but not all, who have the ability to enter into a recursive relationship with semiotic codes, archives of cultural behaviors, modes of communication, and so on outside them that fundamentally restructure their neurophysiological wetware and give them a highly variable ontogeny for just straight-up naturalistic reasons. None of this is philosophy. This is just a naturalistic explanation that give them a highly variable ontology that enables for them a fundamentally self-contestatory relationship to their own being in the world. And it's those kinds of creatures who care what happens to them, right? Not in a just a kind of a chemical stimulus response way, but in a way that involves a fundamentally, reflexive is not the word, but some kind of fundamentally self-contestatory relationship to their own highly variable ontogeny, right? That's why I don't feel bad about killing the mosquito on my arm, and I do feel bad about a chimpanzee being locked up in a cage and being used for biomedical research. So there's a difference between the chimpanzee and the flea on the chimpanzee and the cage that they're both locked in that matters more to the chimpanzee than it does to the flea or to the cage, right? And how to frame that turns out to be a complicated thing to do, actually, right? And the way that I do it is I try to reframe the question of design as residing in this recursive loop between the physiological wetware of certain creatures and a whole repertoire of things external to them that, because they're in this recursive relationship to them, enables them to have this kind of thrownness of design. Now, we talked about this in the seminar this morning. The next shoe to drop is to say, oh, I see. Basically, you're going from being humanist to being mammalist or vertebratist or chordatist, right? But the thing then you have to deal with, and this is why Heidegger is right about the radically inhuman and non-zoological nature of Dasein, as he puts it, the being of beings is not a being, is his very Heideggerian way of putting it. But why he's right about this is one example to point to that we talked about in lunch is the cephalopods, octopuses and squids as well, right? We think that all these behaviors typically are behaviors of vertebrates who, number one, have reasonably long lifespans, and number two, live in social groups. Well, none of that's true for the cephalopods, and yet the cephalopods and a lot of different kinds of octopus and squid clearly demonstrate, it's been observed a zillion times, very high intelligence, very playful behavior, very deceptive behavior, right? Problem solving of problems that they have never been confronted with and never would be confronted with in the wild, so on and so forth. Well, they're not vertebrates. A lot of them only live like 1 or 2 years, and they don't live in social groups by and large. They're solitary, most of them. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that whatever the thrownness of Dasein is can't be tethered with certainty to a zoological substrate, right? And that's fine. To me, this is why the question of where are you going to find that characteristic, to me, remains a permanently open question. And we talked about this at lunch. I firmly believe, and this is why, to me, I kind of just leave the issue open. I firmly believe if you look at what's happened in the last 50 years in our knowledge of non-human animals, and their cognitive lives and their emotional lives and their social interaction, if you look at how radically that's changed in the last 30 or 40 years, it's very likely it's going to change even more and even faster in the next 30 or 40 years. So we may find out stuff about life forms, maybe even plants, I don't know, right? That make different new kinds of demands on us for how we, if we're really talking seriously about legal and political norms of treatment, that make demands on us that we need to find a new kind of vocabulary to be able to talk about, right? It's kind of a long answer to your question, but it's a snapshot of how I try to address this in the book. Yeah.
I just wanted to ask you, I don't know much about but I want to ask you, what's the general, if there is a scholar, general consensus in the field, as well as your personal consensus on atheism versus ethical ontology?
The question was, with regard to posthumanism, what's the difference between, or what do different people say about the difference between ethical omnivorism and veganism? Was that right? I mean, honestly, this is going to sound like a cop-out, but that really depends on who you talk to. We talked about this at lunch today a little bit. the constitutive element of that question is different for different people. So if you're coming from a kind of hardcore, Peter Singer, Tom Reagan animal rights position, the constitutive element of that ethical question is the individual animal, right? And so ethical omnivorism is an oxymoron for those people because it takes for granted the okayness of taking the lives of these animals that you've decided to call killable but not murderable, right? For other people, for whom that's not the constitutive element, but the constitutive element might be something like the value of biodiversity or ecological well-being or environmental justice, then the equation would be very different, and something like ethical locavorism would make more sense. And it's different for different people. I mean, I know people who are vegetarians not because they care about animals, actually. I mean, they might pretend that they do, but that's not really, They're vegetarians for environmental reasons, So I think it really depends on kind of which angle you're coming from. However, just to finish off your question, I would say that both of those answers are posthumanist in their way. They're just posthumanist in different ways. Because the great thing that they don't do is they don't think of what you eat as merely a matter of your own skipping down the hall aesthetic pleasure, right? So they're both positive, I think, in that sense, or both posthumanist in that sense. Because everything in our culture, the whole advertising apparatus of everything in our culture encourages us to not think about the very question you just asked, but encourages us to think about what we eat as a matter of a kind of exercise of our own aesthetic sensibilities and our own freedom and our own pleasure, as if there were no, consequences attached to it. And I got into this because I had no idea. I mean, back when I was a graduate student, I think a lot of it, based on my experience with students, a lot of it's just information. I mean, I did not know that something like factory farming existed. When I was a graduate student, I thought cows in a field. Come on, like a Borden ad or something. I mean, really, and I think students now, I mean, I've seen in my teaching over the years, I think students now are a lot more literate about these issues than I was, when I was an undergraduate or even graduate student. Yeah.
First of all, thank you for an absolutely wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks. Right.
So, what is your take, or others' take, first point, on recent legislative attempts to categorize that as human life with all fully vested rights?
Right.
Which then, for purposes of saying a woman undergoing an abortion,
Right.
becomes an act of murder,
Right.
the same way
Right.
taking human life itself.
Right.
How do those arguments that you've laid out help shape or help us think about that?
Well, yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question. This gets very interesting with regard to the fact that a lot of the recent work in biopolitical thought is actually coming out of Italian political philosophy. So there is, and a lot of feminist critics who have written about Esposito and Agamben and so on have picked up on this. That wow, is there some kind of Italian Catholic thing in the background here? I mean, really, that's working its way out in how life is being thought about in these thinkers. So that question is actually part of the conversation. To me, it's a non-issue for the very reasons that I gave in response to the first question, right? I mean, I'm not persuaded that the kind of thrownness of Dasein and the recursive relationship to a kind of archive technical in the broadest sense factors, and that can be a repertoire of cultural behaviors. It can be a semiotic system. It can be a semiotic code, whatever. The bio of biopolitical thought for me is actually not a substance. It's not a thing. It's not actually located anywhere. It's not a. In my argument against what Derrida calls biologistic continuism, or the argument against trying to find a zoological ground for rights that I alluded to at the end, is part of this. It's actually not located anywhere. The bio of biopolitics, in my view, is actually precisely this recursive loop between the internality of biological and maybe even more specifically neurophysiological wetware, and now we get into questions we were talking about at lunch, like persistent vegetative state, right? It's actually, is there a dynamic recursive loop between that wetware and the externality of these things that enable a dynamic, ongoing thrownness and contestatory relation of the self to itself in relation to that. And that does, in my view, for the moment at least, though it's obviously possible that could change, that doesn't obtain, in my view, when we're talking about human fetuses, right? In the way that it obtains for a dog or a chimpanzee or a dolphin or whatever. Now, again, having said that, all of these kinds of designations and these kinds of line drawing, I think, have to be done, to use Derridian language, they have to be done kind of under erasure. Because if there's anything we know from the history of science, is that those lines change and they move. And so what I'm simply saying is, if you're serious about talking about political and ethical norms, you do have to make decisions. And you do have to, and your decisions and the offering of rights has to be not unconditional but conditional, knowing that eventually, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, you probably will have been wrong in your ascription of justice based on this set of characteristics or that set of characteristics. So it's, and I go into this in the book a lot, especially in the last about 20% of the book is actually about this from the standpoint of thinking about how the law works and thinking about how ethics works in relation to the law. But no, that's a great question, and that's at the center of a lot of these conversations. That's a question for Esposito, for sure. For sure, yeah. Yeah.
Keeping in mind the point that you made that instead of just talking about all life being equal, let's talk about, let's see animals distinctly and then look at how we read them, where we place them politically.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to ask you, when we decide to give certain rights to certain animals, saying that, okay, this animal is headed towards extinction,
Right.
that can also at times be a way of politically controlling certain groups of people. And I'm talking about tribes in India who've been they've been told that you can't hunt deer anymore, which was a big part of their cultural existence.
Right.
And that the fact that the deer
Yeah.
in that area is headed towards extinction is
Right.
not their fault.
Right. Absolutely.
But we are so it becomes a means of biocontrol.
Right.
And so I was thinking, it brings up this point that the question of humanism and posthumanism.
Right.
Or let's begin with posthumanism in the context
Right.
of this talk. It follows a teleology from humanism of a very Western, logo. Like we talk about certain kind of humanism.
Yes.
Posthumanism.
Absolutely.
And not talking about how other tribes.
Right.
Might have a different approach to life.
Right. Yeah.
And so I wanted to take on the culture.
Yeah.
The convergence of the culture of the political.
No. Yeah. No, that's a great question. This is kind of. I forgot to say what your question was before I answer. But well, the previous question was a kind of a right to life question with regard to human fetuses. This question is a question about, it's kind of, I take it as a kind of anthropological question about the situatedness and the self-reference of different traditions with regard to how they relate to human life vis-a-vis the process of globalization. More or less, that's what the question is, right?
I think cultural more than...
Yeah, okay, yeah, right. Fair enough. Cultural, let's say. This is where I think Derrida is right about ethics and people like Peter Singer and Tom Regan are wrong. And we're dealing with two completely irreconcilable understandings of what ethics is here. For Singer and Regan, you essentially propositionally derive, and this is how animal rights philosophy builds its case, you kind of propositionally derive the case for rights based on, okay, we know that these creatures have certain characteristics, sentience, the ability to experience suffering, so on and so forth. Therefore, because they have these capacities, they have a right to be protected against exploitation or those capacities not being respected, so on and so forth. And that's how you build the case. But the bottom line is you walk away with something like a formula in your pocket for what counts as ethical treatment of certain kinds of creatures. And what makes it ethical is that you don't abandon it in the face of complicating, extenuating circumstances, right? So in the face of heavily vested interests, you stick to your guns and you say, no, that's wrong, right? The Derridian, and not just Derridian, the understanding of ethics that comes out of contemporary kind of post-structuralist philosophy, this would be true for Lyotard as well, is exactly the opposite of that. And it involves what Derrida calls confronting the ordeal of the undecidable that presents itself in every ethical decision. So you might have a set of rules, and you could say, well, yeah, I think treating marine mammals in this way is wrong, but the question for Derrida becomes, does it therefore give you the right to waltz into an Inuit community and say, well, back over here at the University of Florida, which, oh, by the way, is, I don't know, 95% white, and I don't know, 70% male, and I don't know, 95% straight. Back over here, we've propositionally derived, in this thing we call academic discourse in the United States, the rules for how different creatures should be treated, and we now know that marine mammals have these kinds of characteristics and so on, and therefore, the culture that you've been living that depends on killing these animals for 2,000 years now, you have to stop. Right? When you put it that way, I think most people go kind of, hang on a second. And I think the reason they go, hang on a second, is that what Derrida describes is that with any application of an ethical rule, you have to confront the ordeal of the undecidable. There are a multitude of factors that configure what he calls the pragmatic situation that you confront, in which the iteration of the rule takes place and has to be tended to, and indeed the rule only exists not because it lives up in the ether somewhere, but because it's always iterated in a concrete context. And those factors, as he points out, are potentially infinite. So from his point of view, Derrida says, look, ironically, if you have a formula in your pocket, you're actually avoiding the ordeal of going through the undecidable about what do I do in this instance, and so you're actually being unethical. And moreover, you're doing something that could be arrived at actually by a mechanical calculation that would not even require judgment, right? And what requires judgment is precisely walking in with, hey, we've talked about this and sorted this out as best we can over here in the culture that I have conversations in. But then you take that into another setting and you have to go through this process. And there is no formula for that, right? And you see this all, I don't know if you know who Greg Mittman is, but Greg Mittman is a guy who works in kind of environmental studies. And he's gotten into filmmaking, and he's making a film right now precisely about this with the issue of elephants in Africa. And it's the same situation you're describing, but maybe even more complicated. Because the elephants, the relationship between the elephants and the people that they're living in really too close proximity to has gotten to the point where the elephants actually now, the people kill the elephants, and the elephants are so damn smart that the elephants actually carry out revenge killings on people in the communities, and actually even they'll go into like the water supply in the village and actually pull it out of the ground. I mean, they're basically being spiteful, and vengeful. And so you've got this, and the question is, well, like, whose fault is it, right? What do we do in this situation? Particularly, as you point out, since the villagers who were thrust into this situation, they may have participated, but they can't be said to have unilaterally caused it in any straightforward sense, So that's, and I don't think, in my view, I'm not interested in trying to declare one of these views of ethics correct. I think that we use them both all the time, and we use them as sticks to beat each other with. But I think Derrida's account, actually, the funny part is, you talk about Derrida and people say, oh, it's this crazy postmodernist, post-structuralist, jargon-ridden, obtuse stuff. But actually, it's Derrida's account of ethics to me that actually empirically describes what people really do in their ethical behavior, not the version that you get from the supposedly much more lay, palatable stuff the Singer and Reagan are doing. So, no, that's okay. Thank you.